Hi everyone, I hope you're all well. I am here today to speak to you about emergency management theories and models for HSP101. This is going to be a really dense lecture. I'm just going to put it out there. There's quite a lot of material to get through, and I'm hoping that everything that I talk about makes sense, and that you can sort of connect up the dots as we're working through it. So, what I'm hoping that we'll get through today is that you'll have an understanding of what theory actually is as a concept, because I think it's important that you understand that in the first instance, and that you get a good sense of what the key concepts are that's guiding the way that we think about and frame emergency management. I'll also go through a couple of key models of emergency management, and then that'll be enough, I think, or I'll make all of your brains melt, I'd say. One of the things that I just wanted to briefly point out is, and I know you've probably heard me say this every single week, is how incredibly complex emergency management is. And one of the things that demonstrates this quite well in this particular case, talking about theories, is that there are so many disciplines that actually inform emergency management in the first instance. So while we've got policing theories, for instance, I know I use that often because it's the area I'm most familiar with, but there's not that huge number of disciplines which inform policing and the way that we think about policing. So certainly psychology, sociology, a little bit of the perhaps geography, a couple of other areas that we're looking at, economics, that type of stuff. But there's not really a huge number of disciplines that inform policing as such. But in emergency management, it's very, very complex because it involves so many different forms of hazards and so forth. So, for instance, one of the people that we're reading from today, the work we're reading from, they talk about how this area is genuinely informed by the following disciplines: geography, meteorology, engineering, anthropology, economics, sociology, psychology, epidemiology, environmental science, political science, public administration, law, journalism, security, and criminal justice. Now that's pretty massive, really, when you think about it. That's such a huge range of disciplines literally funneling into this thing that we call emergency management. And most importantly, that informs the concepts and theories and ideas that we use to try and conceptualize emergency management. So before I get into the overall stuff about the emergency management specific, I really wanted to talk about what this notion is called theory. Now, theory is essentially a word that describes how we conceptualize, so as thinking, talking, writing, something or some relationship. So it's essentially theorizing how emergency management happens, okay? Concepts are, of course, equated with theory. They have a strong relationship, and you'll often find a theory and there's a whole bunch of concepts that plug into that theory, right? Which is what we're going to be talking about today in relation to emergency management. Concepts create mental images of things in the minds of those that speak, read, and hear about those things. A great example of this, which I always use, is a fish. So we might have a million different types of fish that are out there in the seas, and we've got certain names for them, and they all look different, and they have different types of behaviour. But ultimately, the universal sign for a fish is that, that very simple little shape. That's a concept of a fish. So concepts help us think through theories of different types of practices and activities. But I think that'll become clearer as we work through this lecture a bit more. I want to make the point that theory doesn't precede emergency management, not proceed, but precede. So theory doesn't come before it. The activities of emergency management happen, and then we sit back and go, that's really interesting, which was why I've put the thinking face on this slide. Because we sit back and we genuinely think about, well, how did that happen? What could we do better? What are the ways that we can think about this as an actual activity? So emergency management practice comes before the theory, and it's the same in pretty much any discipline in that respect. We've never had a theory of something existing before the actual activity itself exists, if that makes sense. So what we're talking about today is ways of thinking about, explaining what emergencies are, how emergencies happen, and what emergency management work involves. But that's probably less of a focus today overall. Interestingly enough, this is probably something that you do every single day, and that's something that I'll try and talk through more on the Milo site for you this week, is where you're doing it informally. Something really serious happens, then you look at the way that, some organisation has responded. It might be a bushfire or whatever, and a certain organisation hasn't responded appropriately. And you think, how could they respond like that? It just doesn't make sense. Why would they do that? Why would they make such a big mistake? And that in itself is a process of theorising. We're trying to conceptualise what the motivations were for that particular process. So it's probably something you're already doing. We're just sticking a label on it, right? In this lecture today. As well as that, theories are really useful, and we can come up with theories around emergency management by looking at patterns of emergency management activity. So all of these people that love statistics, I'm not a lover of statistics, but that's just me. Me and numbers don't get along very well. So we look at those statistics, we can look at the patterns in those statistics, and we can get a sense of what types of activities we need to be focused on. That is in itself a form of theorising. So, for instance, we know that in Japan they have a lot of earthquakes. Now, we know that from past earthquakes, the fact that it's very, very regular, and it's something that they really need to be extremely aware of. So, they would look at the patterns of activity with aftershocks and earthquakes and tremors and all of that sort of stuff in Japan in order to be able to predict where the next big earthquake is going to happen and how it's going to impact the people in those areas. Now, they're not often right on target, but there has been a couple of times where they have literally predicted exactly where it is going to happen, and they've had all of those people in that area spot on prepared, and no one has been injured. So it's really, really important that we do this type of work where we're actually looking at patterns and theorising and making predictions about how we need to do emergency management work. So overall, we're kind of providing models about how we do emergency management and what that actually looks like. Most importantly, though, it's no one single theory that we ascribe to. There's a whole range of different things or ways of thinking out there that actually just help us to think through the work of emergency management in different ways. So, for instance, I was reading recently, I've completely forgotten, surprise management theory, that's what it's called. This is actually a theory of governance of emergency management. It's the way that we work towards a form of governance so that we can help make emergency management easier and to ensure that there's no loss of life and all of that sort of stuff. Surprise management theory, and it's something I think we'll talk about further down the track when we talk about how things go wrong and, reflecting on disasters in the past that haven't worked the best. But that in itself is something that really helps us to understand that particular element of emergency management. So in a lot of ways, all of these ways of thinking about this have a use. There's no one single way that we can do that. Now, before we get into the actual stuff that talks about emergency management itself and how we conceptualize that, I wanted to briefly talk about how we conceptualize disasters and emergencies. Now, this is something that we're going to touch on next week again when we talk about types of emergencies and disasters and so forth. But I think it's nice to just quickly touch on it now. Now, Costin talks a little bit about this in a paper that I found, and he says that there's 4 different ways that we talk about emergencies or disasters, and you can see that these are quite informal. It's certainly not a formal way of doing things. So, for instance, a lot of people will talk about a disaster or emergency as an act of God, that the deity is punishing people, that they're subjecting them to some sort of colossal crisis to desolate the human race as a form of punishment for sin. And that's kind of the image that we get, that is conjured up a lot when we look at movies and stuff like that. And this image here is one of the ones that I found that definitely brings up that image that we most often see in the movie, that will often, kind of get people thinking in that respect broadly about whether or not it is an act of God and whether or not we are being punished, because it's just so incredibly catastrophic. The second way that he says that we conceptualize emergencies or disasters is talking about it rather than through the human world, but as just a natural thing. It's the agent itself which is creating the disasters, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, landslides, all of those types of things. So it's got nothing to do with the human world. It's just something that happens in nature and that we need to be prepared for. Oh, by the way, I should mention, I've put a quote on this slide here from Costin's work in terms of the first point. It's talking about a collapse of a railway bridge, and this is I think it's a priest that's talking about this. It says, if there is one voice louder than others, this was in 1879, there was one voice louder than others in this terrible event, it is that of God. Determined to guard his Sabbath with jealous care, God does not afflict except with good cause. The Sabbath of God has been dreadfully profaned by great public companies. These wicked people are actually going to have the audacity to rebuild this bridge. It is is it not awful to think that the passengers, must have been carried away when they were transgressing the law of God? Now, so they're actually talking about a train bridge here, and the collapse of this railway bridge led to the deaths of 75 people. And this person is genuinely making the argument that God doesn't want these two land masses to meet, and that's why the collapse happened. So that's what we mean by the conceptualization through the act of God. Whereas nature is much more just about saying, well, it just happens and we're going to have to deal with it. That is the cause of these particular major events. Sometimes they talk about disaster as the joint effect between nature and society, that it's an interaction between a physical event and a human system, and this is quite interesting. So, for instance, it's the idea that if a tree falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it, does it actually make a noise? So if there is a colossal disaster somewhere and there are no physically present human beings, does that count as a disaster? Is it actually a disaster in any way, shape or form? And people genuinely argue that if humans were not there, it would not actually technically be classified as a disaster. So it's a really interesting argument. Most importantly, though, the failure to anticipate major changes in the environment, can often lead to detrimental effects. So a lot of people will talk about this in relation to climate change, and there is quite a bit of literature in the emergency management discussions around the ways in which climate change is happening at such a rapid rate, yet we are continuing to ignore those things. This is where this particular argument would be perfectly applied. So it's a joint interaction between what's happening in nature, but the fact that it's coming from a human source of intervention that is creating the change in nature. So human intervention is heating up the world. This is making the polar ice caps melt. The water is rising, and that's what's changing nature, right? So people argue that it's the combination of those two things which creates a disastrous event. And of course, we can physically see that happening. There's a lot of climate change skeptics out there, but we seem to be overlooking the quite significant numbers of places that are literally disappearing off the world map because of this process of global warming at the moment and climate change. But of course, we don't need to talk about those people. They're not important, apparently. They don't get much airtime in the national or international media, unfortunately, and they're one of the most significant refugee issues at the present time is entire small islands in certain areas of the world where there are thousands and thousands of people that are displaced on an annual basis. They literally have to leave because they are going to drown if they stay, and it's not habitable anymore. So the final one talks about a disaster as a socially constructed event. Now, this is quite a hard one to get your head around, but it relates to how human beings have caused or exacerbated a particular disaster due to the way that they have used the land or they've lacked planning. Now, a great example of this, again, I used the Japanese earthquakes as an example because it demonstrates quite well a number of the key issues. They had, sorry, I'm trying to think of it again. So the colossally difficult outcome for them was they had a major earthquake. The earthquake they were fairly well prepared for. The oncoming tsunami they were not prepared for in any way, shape or form. So everyone responded well to the earthquake, and they had structures that were built in a way that withstood it quite well. But when the tsunami came through, it just absolutely decimated the place. And you could see that people were completely unprepared for that tsunami. As a result of that, tsunami and the earthquake, of course, then the nuclear meltdown happened. Now, that is what we would call a socially constructed event. They certainly didn't anticipate the nuclear meltdown, I don't think, in this particular instance. And in fact, if you read the articles about this event, you can see that the decision makers at the helm of this process, when it was happening, they held off for quite a number of hours before, pouring ocean water into the reactors in order to cool them down and stop the nuclear meltdown. So that's what we call a socially constructed event. They genuinely had a lot of say in that process, and it was because of human intervention.